My name is Sidhartha. I'm one of the panelists for today's talk. I'm so excited to be here to discuss this important issue in this context of substance addiction. And I want to thank Dee and Susan and the other organizers who have put together this program for having us here, and also Rick and Robert for having the vision to address this important issue and also include this particular topic that we feel is so important, not only for Cape Cod, but across the country. And I'm so honored to share the panel with Peter DiMarzio from the Department of Homeland Security and Kate Price, a fantastic advocate for human trafficking survivors. So we have an hour to cover this, and we'll take questions at the end. I'm going to get going with this. That's just a disclosure slide. We have nothing to disclose. The learning objectives are to demonstrate understanding that human trafficking and substance addictions are two interconnected public health issues. So because so far in this event, those of you who have been attending these events, you've been exposed to having a good understanding of the issues of substance addiction, what happens with that as a health issue, as a public health use. But what today we want to talk about is to see the connection between how substance addiction, from a victim's perspective, is interconnected with becoming a victim of human trafficking. And we'll describe some of the indicators of potential human trafficking in a substance-addicted individual. So if you're coming across a substance addiction patient, client, how to identify that person could be a potential victim of human trafficking. We'll talk about that. And then we'll explain some of the challenges and opportunities, and Peter will take the lead on that to describe what are the barriers and what are the opportunities there are in rescuing these victims of human trafficking and rehabbing them to kind of allow them to re-enter the civilian world. So today, the outline of the talk today would be just touching upon the link between these two issues and what to look for and how to deal with a healthcare encounter when you're seeing a client or a patient for a substance addiction issue, but who could be a victim of human trafficking. How to identify those symptoms and signs, and how do you do safe referrals? Because it is key to know that doing the right thing in those individuals should also be done in a way that is maintaining the safety of the victim and not adding to harm, or not making sure that they are not put into danger. So safe referrals is key, and we'll talk about that. And Kate Price will talk about her story of survival as a human trafficking victim, and also bring a lot of wisdom from her advocacy work on the recovery process and some of the tools of change that can be brought to play here. And Peter will talk about the scope of safety and security in the United States regarding human trafficking, and also the rescue and rehab of these substance-addicted victims who are human trafficking victims as well. So, we are in a CME conference, and I just want to touch upon, talking about evidence here, because I come from a public health background as well, and I'm trained in creating evidence and looking at evidence and building practice guidelines. And I want to mention that because of the nature of the issue being a crime, a human trafficking issue, it is a largely underreported crime, which makes it that the statistics and the evidence that you would see are, for a great deal, are underestimates. I think it's important to remember that. And also, when we look at data, evidence in terms of practice, in terms of policy making, a lot of the times evidence there are different ways to build the evidence or look at evidence. And I just want to touch upon this, that most of you might have the idea, and it's the right thing, that the randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for evidence when we talk about medical scientific evidence and in CME conferences. In these kind of issues, when we're talking about an underreported crime like human trafficking, it is hard to build evidence based on randomized controlled trials. And it is accepted largely in scientific community. This was published in the Circulation Journal, peer-reviewed medical journal, that randomized controlled trials are not always possible. And in certain situations, it's not even appropriate to look for such evidence. So I just want to give that premise as we go along to talk about the evidence we have in this particular issue in this CME conference. So just a basic definition of what is human trafficking. It's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Those three are key defining words there: force, fraud, or coercion, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. So these three elements need to be there in order to be defined as a human trafficking situation. If the victim is a minor, then these three elements need not be present to call it or define it as a human trafficking situation. And one of the common misconceptions that I want to clear here is that a victim need not be physically transported from one location to another in order for the crime to be defined as human trafficking. It's not. It's different from what's normally known as smuggling. So, and just looking at the scope of these two major public health issues we're talking about here, substance addiction, as you all well aware of, that 78 Americans die every day from an opioid overdose. So and that's why we are here to talk about what to do about that and how to help them out. At least half of all the opioid overdose deaths involve prescription drug in some form. And looking at the human trafficking, and just want to remind you again, these are underestimates because the whole issue is underreported. And even with that underestimates, we know that since 2007, the number of cases reported, confirmed for human trafficking victims is more than 25,000. And the number of reported cases just this year, up until this was, I was pulling this data in August, so up until August, it's 1,654. And some of you, or many of you, may be from Cape Cod, and even in this past year, we have had instances on the Cape, which has been reported in the media, and that in Yarmouth, there was a case where there were convictions of human trafficking cases. And in another case that was reported earlier this year from a person in Randolph where there was 21 convictions, 9 of those convictions were related to Cape Cod. So this is an issue that is not a rare event. This is an issue that is not that's out happening somewhere else. It's happening right in our backyard. It's happening in every state of this country. It has been reported. And the number of children in the U.S. who are at risk for commercial sexual exploitation is 325,000. That's an annual estimate. And those are references. And I think the slides will be shared with you. So I have a lot of references in these slides, which you may not be able to read them from there, but we will be able to share the slides through the organizers. This slide is just to show that there is a definite link between substance addiction and human trafficking. The trauma leads to use of substance to escape from the reality, but many a times you would see that the drugs are used by the traffickers to control the victims. That's a means of control, and these are data to support that. Now, the issue about why do healthcare workers need to know about this issue, and what is the relevance, what's the importance, is that the trauma, any adverse childhood experience leads to illnesses, both mind, body, and spirit. So psychiatric illnesses, substance addictions, chronic diseases even, and leading to shorter lifespans. We do know that psychiatric illness leads to shorter lifespan, but it's also very well known that trauma, adverse childhood experiences lead to shorter lifespans. In a couple of other studies I want to pull in is in 2011, there was a national survey done of trafficking victims, of which half of them went through the healthcare system. So for any reason, they went to the emergency room, they went to a dentist. So half of them went through the healthcare system, and the percentage of victims identified as victims by those healthcare professionals was 0. So not a single person victim was picked up as a human trafficking victim in those healthcare encounters. I mean, it's not just another study in 2014, 88% of the sample victims went through healthcare system. Again, the percentage of these victims identified as victims of human trafficking during those healthcare encounters is again 0. So there's a compelling case here to educate healthcare professionals, substance addiction specialists, behavioral health specialists, to know how to identify a victim who's right in front of you during an encounter, because that is an opportunity, and many of them just are not going to be able to come forward to disclose that because they are under fear, they are under threat, and it is up to the healthcare community to be educated, to know about it, and to know how to safely handle those situations. And there are some standardized screening tools. Again, you'll get these slides, so I can also look through it in detail once you have that. The rapid screening tool for child trafficking, and that's a quick initial screen that you could use, and then you can follow that up with something called as a comprehensive screening and safety tool for child trafficking. That's based on the International Organization for Adolescents. And there are different counties and states have come up with their own tools. They're pretty decent to look at and adapt to your own community. This one is from the San Francisco County Commercial Sexually Exploited Children Screening Procedure Guideline, the Rescue and Restore, which is part of the HHS. And this is a pretty comprehensive one that I would recommend looking at. This is from the Polaris Project and the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, called the Comprehensive Human Trafficking Assessment. This HEATS screening, some of you in the behavioral health profession who are here may already be familiar with that. It's a psychosocial screening tool, and that could be easily adapted to a human trafficking situation in terms of screening for identification. And just the symptoms and clinical signs to look for: PTSD, depression and anxiety, infectious diseases including HIV and other STDs, reproductive health problems, substance abuse that we're talking about today, any effects of physical trauma, headaches, fatigue, back pain, dizziness, and dental problems. I mean, it could be a mix of these symptoms, but you will find a patient of yours that is, one of the clues I've come to realize is that when you have a patient who's, you're taking medical history in an intake, and then you're examining them, and there is something that's not matching, that's something to trigger that, the patient might be withholding some information, and it's, a lot of the times we tend to think that it could be something that is not related to safety issues, but it could be very well that they are victims and that they are not disclosing the full information. And these are some of the difficult patients that we think of. It's not cooperating, and that's what's going on. So it's up to us to keep that in mind, to give the benefit of doubt to these victims and patients to identify that. I just want to close with a success model that was tested in a village in Indonesia, In Indonesia, especially in these villages, it is a very rampant issue to have human trafficking. Girls go through this. And this was based on the concept of what's called as positive deviance. And this was rolled out in 2003 for a 2-year program. And the program elements was looking at involving community members into a broad, comprehensive program. But the fundamental part of the program was that it involved education. It involved talking about an issue which nobody wanted to talk about. And I think it applies for communities, it applies for the public, it applies for professional and healthcare communities like we are here, talking about an issue that nobody wants to talk about. And that made a big difference in this village. So openly discussing with children and community members about the risks. And some of the elements they put in place was, other than the education, was engaging women and girls in income-generating activities, giving them vocational training, small businesses, and but the big piece was always on education. And this was published in the Journal of Creative Communications. And what they found after the 2-year intervention was that there were 0 cases of trafficking at the end of 2 years. And this was a place where it was a rampant issue. And 20 averted attempts at girl trafficking were documented, and a 15-member community watch group was created, a girls club was created, and the taboo about discussing trafficking was broke. Now imagine this is a conservative village in Asia, where you would imagine how much of a taboo it is to discuss any sexual issues, not just human trafficking, sexual trafficking issues. So I think it's key to realize the value in education, the value in just creating awareness, how much it can make a difference. Because a lot of the times this issue happens in the dark, and education is the light that needs to be shined on this issue to create a change. And so some of the screening tools that I mentioned, we will share it through the slides, and I think it's a very interesting and valuable tool to look at if you are a healthcare professional and if you do come across substance-addicted victims. And there are trainings for healthcare professionals. This was recently released by the HHS. And I think the online CME is closing in at this point, but they do have an in-person CME that is done in different parts of the country. There's none in Massachusetts right now, but there's one in Chicago that's coming up in a couple of weeks, I believe. You can look it up online. In Cape Cod, what I'm part of the Cape Cod PATH, the People Against Trafficking in Humans. We have a task force here. Some of the members are here, and they have a table number 104, I believe, today. So please stop by and find out what you can do to collaborate with them in the community. Some of the members are here. I'm going to ask them to raise up so that people know how they can approach you and talk to you. Do you mind, Meredith? Please, yeah. Yeah, and they do a fantastic job on this issue, so please give them a big hand. Yeah. That's. I think it's important for healthcare communities and community entities to collaborate on this issue. This is not that is not something that can be dealt with by one entity alone. I think it takes a village. The other program that we're trying to roll out on the Cape is the Cape Cod PATH and Emerald Physicians, where I work at, and Cape Cod Healthcare. We are bringing a CME program specifically on this in the fall. It will be in October. And there will be another conference later planned for next spring as well. And so I want to finish with saying the role of healthcare provider is in this issue is to treat the signs and symptoms by identifying the victims. The role is also as a mental health counselor to support the victim through the trauma, recovery, and rehab, identifying the victims and doing safe referrals, and as an influence over research and publication policies. When Kate is coming on board to talk about, Kate is now part of the Freedom Clinic, which is part of Mass General. And that is a place where if you, in a healthcare encounter, if you do identify a victim, that's a place where you can do a safe referral. It's an anonymous referral. She'll talk more about that. With that, I would like to close. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to have Kate Price come on board. Thanks. Thank you.
morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to my favorite place on earth, is Cape Cod. I live outside of Boston, but I am lucky enough that my in-laws live in Brewster, so we spend quite a bit of time here, although I must admit it was really hard to come down last night, and then I've got to actually drive back right after this to go, so my son to his activities for the weekend. So I want to say a few things to follow up from Sidhartha before I go into my presentation. So I'm really grateful to be a part of Cape Cod PATH, and it's so nice to see people out here. That, to me, it's incredibly important that I think we look for a particular victim. What does a human trafficking victim look like? I'm a human trafficking survivor. I was trafficked from my very first memories until about age 12 or 13 by my exploiter, who was an immediate family member. It was to support his drug addiction. So that's what one thing, a big message for me throughout my presentation today is I was never addicted. I have a PTSD. I was given drugs. I was forced to drink, but I have a PTSD reaction to drugs, to needles. And so you don't have to be addicted to be impacted as a human trafficking survivor, because I'll talk more about this. It's this system of dominance and control and addiction and all, porn and all of these factors working together, that it isn't just human trafficking singularly. I think in the same way that you all are substance abuse experts to say that substance abuse it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are all of these other co-occurring issues going on. So I want to show you, so this is a picture of me when I was growing up. This is what a human trafficking victim looks like. And so to realize, this is just like kids everywhere. But one of the biggest things that's going on, I think particularly right now, is that when we're looking at human trafficking and drugs in the same way that was outside of my house in Appalachia. I grew up in northern Appalachia. I grew up right next to the town that is now a meth capital of the state where I was born. I honestly believe that, and this was in the late 70s, the 70s and early 80s, was that my exploiter worked at a hospital. I really honestly believe that he was using pharma-grade meth. This was because this was kind of the precursor, and I've since done research. Oh, hi! I've done research, sorry. I've done research, to realize that pharma-grade meth was a precursor to current meth. Again, you guys are much more experts in this, but it's more kind of as I'm piecing my story together. But now, human trafficking has recently surpassed drugs in terms of the largest, fastest growing and largest criminal industry. So it's guns, human trafficking, and drugs. And it used to be human trafficking was after drugs. So we realize these things are growing in separately, but they're also very much in consort, these three things together. And it's a $41 billion industry. And that's another thing I really talk about in terms of trafficking, was that we think about trafficking. I think about trafficking, particularly as a human trafficking survivor advocate, is very much in terms of a caring way, of a sentimentality. These are human beings, we are doing this. In terms of traffickers, this is an industry. This is a business. Human beings are nothing but a vehicle for money. That's it. And I think we really get caught sometimes when we think about, these poor victims, they are recruited and they fill a role. And I think we need to think about it in that way, because when we think about it in terms of sentimentality, that is one way that traffickers win, I think, because it's just like, oh, look, they say to victims all the time, what are you going to do? You're going to go out and get food stamps? What are you going to do? Where are you going to live? There are no shelters. It's like our human services are woefully inadequate. Traffickers know this. Traffickers count on this. They count on this. They count on big pharma, and apologies if any big pharma people are here, but they count on things like the opioid industry. These are all businesses that are competing for our dollars. And I apologize, and at the same time, I don't apologize, because this is exactly why I'm now 46 years old. It's just now being able to stand up in front of you, that I'm 46 years old, I'm getting my PhD now. I should have been getting my PhD when I was 20 years old, 23 years old, like my classmates. But I wasn't, because I was in recovery. I was going to Al-Anon meetings. I was healing from what had happened to me. And so it's like, I really feel like in a lot of ways, I lost 10, 20 years of my life, even though I was a walking person, because all of these things are going on, and a lot of people made money, and a lot of people knew. And to me, for the longest time, I couldn't speak out. It was really too difficult for me. But now I'm more angry about it and care more about that this is still happening, more than I am scared of my family, and more than I am scared of people speaking out against me. I'm also feel very much in terms of surrounded by people like Sidhartha, like Peter, like Homeland Security. You know, people are paying attention to this, thankfully, and yet it's still very much happening, and there's a lot going on. So that's my little, you know, fight the power speech. But thank you. All right, see, I'm not going to get to my slides. I'm just going to keep going on and on. So I will say this in terms of that you are the people who are in contact with people who are being trafficked. Like I said, it is co-occurring with substance abuse. And in that 2014 study, I was a respondent in that study. I had gone to seek health care. No one helped me. I was never identified as a trafficking victim. So I was also one of those people who was incredibly obstinate. You know, it's like, I'm not a victim. What are you talking about? Get away from me. You know, F you. Like that whole like PTSD reaction, that like to me, that's a key indicator. When someone is uncooperative, they are most likely a human trafficking survivor. Something's going on. And the key is to keep asking. It might take months, it might take years, it might even take decades, but keep asking and show that you are a person that person can trust. Because some people, one teacher asked, something was wrong. She suspected something was wrong. One person asked. And when I said nothing, that was it. She stopped asking. Since found out that family friends suspected that something was wrong, but they didn't want to say anything. Because it's a private family matter. You know, no one intervened. This one teacher asked one time, that was it. That was it. So keep asking, and you are very much in the position to keep asking. All right, so that is my answers to those. So now I will go on in terms of so the links between sexual exploitation and substance abuse. And a lot of these links I've been recently learning as I have become more and more involved with the Freedom Clinic at Mass General Hospital. I'm incredibly proud to be a research assistant with them. It is it's a clinic, a free clinic for human trafficking survivors. And one of the key issues, though, that we're finding in terms of identifying survivors is that a lot of people, even themselves, don't identify as survivors. I'm currently doing a study, and I'm doing a study, and I have recruitment flyers, but even just for sex trafficking, I needed to make 4 different flyers because there's different wording. It's like, do you identify as a trafficking victim? Do you identify as a sex worker? Have you made money selling sex? Have you ever exchanged sex for food, shelter, or other needs? Has anyone ever paid another person to have sex with you in exchange for food, shelter, or other needs? Have you ever had sex for money because a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, or a family member asked or forced you? All of those ways, that is human trafficking. And I think one of the cultural narratives that we really have is that a person had this really great life, and then a bad man came in, sucked them away into this horrible world of human trafficking. All we need to do is reach in, grab them, get them out of there, and then everything's going to be fine. That's not the case in my experience, is that all of these other things are going on, and a key thing is substance abuse. I think a lot of people who have exchanged sex for drugs are just like, I'm just a bad person. I'm not a human trafficking victim. I don't deserve to get free health care. I don't deserve this. There's all of that shame and stigma. And I'm really proud to be a part of the Freedom Clinic because we're saying, no, like you are very much a human trafficking victim, a human trafficking survivor, and let's get you health care access. So one of the links, very much the cycles of sexual abuse, exploitation, addiction, that was very much my experience growing up. I grew up in a family that was completely and utterly immersed in intergenerational cycles of poverty, addiction, mental illness, substance abuse, alcoholism. My exploiters' parents were the town drunks, and that was very much that's just what happens to those people. They're white trash. I was completely and utterly disposable. So the families of origins, intergenerational. I am absolutely convinced that my exploiter was exploited by his mother. I'm certain of it. She was really, I think, the town prostitute. And so it was just, again, it's like that's what those people do to one another. Genetics and addiction. I'm not an expert on this in any way, shape, or form, but I had a woman recently said to me, she's like, well, you got really lucky. You got born with the right brain and the right genes, so you're not addicted and you can, have academic proclivity. I don't know how I feel about that, and at the same time, I know that there's, research is showing I'm a huge NPR fan. I watch like every Frontline ever, so I know that there is a link between genetics and addiction, and so just realizing that that's an emerging conversation. One of my favorite sayings ever is hurt people, and that was Bessel van der Kolk, who is a trauma expert, and I'm incredibly proud to say that he is a mentor to me, and he's actually my personal therapist, which is very random, but that he does see private patients. I was working at Harvard at the time, and the therapist I was seeing saw him speak, and she's like, oh, do I have a patient for you? And so I'm very lucky that he's been my therapist for about 20 years, and I am actually in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. I cannot recommend that book enough in terms of trauma, and I get all teary, but he is very much a very special person to me, and literally, he saved my life. Again, the silence and the shame. Then I think the other thing we don't talk about that often is the cultural construction of addiction and trafficking. So there's very much of a racial discrimination and class bias, I believe, at least in terms of trafficking. Again, I'm not the expert in terms of substance abuse, but I think we have this idea of what does a victim look like, and we have this idea, particularly of children, that there's this sense of childhood innocence, and that childhood innocence really is blonde, blue-eyed, white, high level of education, a lot of access to educational opportunities, to healthcare, and so if a child, and also very listens to his or her parents, it's like kind of that all-American kid. And if a child doesn't fit that role, then somehow that child is a bad kid who somehow deserves what he or she deserves. Again, I'm really glossing over this. I give an entire talk about this very topic. But just even the idea that more children of color are incarcerated than white kids. Even though studies do show that there are more white kids being trafficked than children of color, more children of color end up in jail. So, and there's also in terms of poor communities as well, where do drugs end up, in terms of poverty being the second highest indicator of child sex trafficking, the first being child sexual abuse. It's a really great book. Again, heard her on NPR. The Unbroken Brain. She's not a clinician. She's a journalist, but she has been covering substance abuse. And she talks about in terms of sensitive kids, that's when they get into using substances. And in childhood or in teenage years, and then that puts addiction longer into adulthood. And I just thought that was an incredibly interesting idea. We're a culture in pain. We think about how many opioids are prescribed. We're in physical pain. We are in mental pain. I do have in my next slide, talking about the adverse childhood experiences study that Sidhartha mentioned. So this study was done in the early aughts, and it was 17,000 people who were actually mostly white and upper middle class and middle class. They found that at least 47% of those people had at least one adverse childhood experience. And the more adverse childhood experiences they had was the higher gradation, and not just for depression or suicidality or substance abuse, but it was diabetes, cancer, kind of everyday illnesses from these adverse childhood experiences. I actually just heard, again on the news, yesterday that now loneliness is now a higher indicator for healthcare issues than obesity in the United States. I mean, that floored me, but we are an isolated culture in pain. And then the other one is the norms of masculinity, being dominant and control. Again, I give a whole nother talk on this too, and I have an 11-year-old son, so this is very much of a big topic in our house, in terms of that, you must be upright, stiff upper lip, you don't ask for help. In order to belong as a boy and as a man in this culture, you have to put down other men, and you certainly have to put down other women, and you have to use and objectify women. And that is how you belong. And that very sense of belonging is what we need. Otherwise, we feel the isolation and the aloneness, and that is what has surpassed obesity. I'm going to have to fly through these. I want to be mindful of time. So precursors to sexual exploitation for children and adults. Again, I've spoken about a lot of this already, but the cultural norms of violence, so the adverse childhood experiences study. The one thing that I found very interesting about this particular study was that it isn't just talking about, we think about adverse childhood experiences being physical abuse, sexual abuse, but in this study, they actually also included a parent being incarcerated, divorce, so it is that separation and that isolation, and really acknowledging how much that hurts the body. UNICEF statistics, we think of ourselves as a culture that supports children. Well, the United States is #1 amongst industrialized nations of children dying from abuse and neglect. We're #1. We're #2 amongst industrialized nations of children living in poverty. And this is consistent over decades. #2. And those are the top indicators for child sexual exploitation. And the other thing that happens, though, too, is, so the average entry age of sexual exploitation is 11 to 14, but then once a child turns 18, then all of a sudden he or she is considered an adult, and then all of a sudden they're making an informed choice. And all the services drop out for them. And so we, just not having that continuation of services. We also think about cultural priorities of safety. We completely objectify children sexually more and more. I mean, I don't even need to say much about that in terms of advertising. We ignore child sexual abuse and neglect as a public health priority. And we have those gender norms. That a study that I'm doing as a part of my work at UMass Boston is we are interviewing organizations that work with sexually exploited children. And one person who works primarily with boys, mostly with boys and trans youth, said about how one social service person said, well, boys can't be sexually abused. Like, it's literally impossible for a boy to be sexually abused. It's like that norm that boys want and should have access to sex at all times. And if they are ever abused or neglected, that it's somehow, well, that's not a problem because that's what men just want. And so even those gender norms are a very violent way in terms of people growing up in exploitation. Again, I'll go through these pretty quickly. In terms of exploiters in demand, they recruit and grooming. I think there's a lot of literature out about that. One of the key things we don't talk about, though, is obedience. There is a wonderful quote in Judy Herman's book, the second edition of Trauma and Recovery, that she talks about. She interviews a pimp, she cites actually someone who interviews a pimp, and it says the pimp basically says, look, I look for incest survivors because they're the most obedient, because they're scared to lose the uncle or the brother that molested them. And so that's what you mostly want in terms of trafficking. You want someone who's going to be obedient, someone who's going to listen. He talks about sexual expertise doesn't matter, what you look like doesn't matter. The key component is obedience. And again, the right to sex at all times. Again, these are multi-billion-dollar industries. There's no sentimentality whatsoever. Pharmaceutical companies, I think we're talking, what is it now? The statistic is there is a prescription for every opioid, for every person in this country, there's a prescription for opioids. Treatment programs are also an industry. I know there are a lot of, I am not equating treatment programs to big pharma, please. But I'm more talking about in terms of treatment programs and having access to healthcare, having access to social capital and resources, and even in terms of HMOs and treatment. I'm sure you all could give this seminar in terms of treatment programs and HMOs and all of that, but going on with healthcare in our country. The other multi-billion-dollar industry that absolutely and totally fuels trafficking is pornography. The few buyers who have been studied say that the number one reason that he or she, mostly he, but he buys sex is because trafficking, a person who is being sexually exploited will do what he or she, what that person's partner will not do. And it's like you pay to have control. I personally believe that trafficking and prostitution, you're purchasing sex, there's a biological component to it, but there's also you're buying this illusion of dominance and control by handing over money. Oh, that's my time. I will finish up quickly. You are saying, here, I've got this disposable income, I'm going to give this, and now I own you for the next hour or however long. Okay, I'll go really quick. Victim, so the co-occur systems and services, criminal justice, needing safe, clean housing, economic opportunity, Department of Children and Families, one organization I work with, 65% of their referrals are kids from Department of Children and Families. And you can imagine, these are kids, who have no safety net whatsoever. Plus, on top of it, in Massachusetts, the budget for Department of Children and Families is now less than it was in 2006. So it's like same with me, just kids, these are kids, they'll just figure it out. The support system, 12-step programs were huge for me in terms of I went to Al-Anon. I spent about 5 years going to meetings pretty much every single day, and that really taught me how to just even be able to sit next to people. That was a huge thing for me. Leaving old playmates and old playgrounds, that is a phrase used by Rochelle Dalla, who is a wonderful prostitution and trafficking researcher out of University of Nebraska. She talks about you need to leave. In an Al-Anon, they call it the geographical cure. That's very much what I needed to do. I needed to move to Boston from where I grew up. And it was incredibly hard, but at the same time, there are very different rules. Drug culture, substance abuse culture has very, very different rules than not that, and in terms of authenticity and healing. And it really broke my heart, but I really needed to leave these people that I considered my family, so I catch my breath. Needing to teach relational skills and healing shame. The final thing I will say is in terms of tools for change, accountability. Social capital can cover up abuse and addiction. I now live in a very, very, very wealthy town. We live in the cheapest real estate in that town, but still I live in a very wealthy town. And in terms of, having that social capital that you can cover up more than poor families. Impunity for perpetrators of child sexual abuse and exploitation. In our study, we actually heard police officers, law enforcement saying, well, we don't want to arrest these college kids, who are buying sex because we don't want to ruin their lives. You think about the Stanford swimmer, it's just like, 3 months, because we don't want him to ruin his life. And at the same time, if those people were people of color or poor people, they would be in jail for 20 years, or I don't even know what the sentencing is. Freedom of speech defense, back page, say, well, this is America, the freedom of speech, we have entrepreneurial. Again, business, this is dollars, we're talking about dollars. And I'm not putting down dollars at all, but I'm saying that they can be used and manipulated in ways that make people very much at risk. Protecting buyers' identities, lawyers, judges, police, they are very much buyers of sex, doctors as well, and that is incredibly hard for me. That's one of the things we're finding is why people don't want to come to the clinic, is because some of their buyers are doctors. Trauma-informed responses, long-term supports for victims, increased resources for a spectrum of services. This stuff takes time to heal. You all know this. It doesn't happen in is like 12 therapy sessions. It doesn't happen that way. And so we need more long-term responses. And the training for first responders, that keep asking. When you see someone who's really obstinate, keep asking and try and really start establishing that feeling of trust. Even if the person spits in your face, tells you to F off, and you never want to talk to them again, still give that person your card. Say, you call me. And even if they swear at you again, you call me. You can be that one person to establish that sense of trust, just like Bessel was for me, and that will absolutely and utterly change and transform someone's life. So thank you.